If you want to nail ESG, you really need to know how to run the numbers. In this case study, we will go through that and get you there. In this case, what we're going to do is walk through a complex environmental investment where we need to figure out the concrete impact and the benefits of these investments we're planning to make. Otherwise, we will just be in the dark. For my case study, I have chosen Kunda Cement plant. Kunda Cement plant is located in the country of Estonia, just off the coast, across from Helsinki in Finland. It's a couple of 100 kilometers due east of Estonia's capital Tallinn and about 400 kilometers away from St. Petersburg in Russia. One of the main reasons that I've chosen Kunda for this case study, and the reason for which the study was made in the 1990s, is that Kunda is a relatively isolated plant. It's much more easy to connect the effects of an environmental change with the investment I make. Because there are no other major plants in the region, the effects of the investment are not mixed up with the effects of other plants in the region. This solves a problem we have in calculating externalities, known as the attribution effect. Like if I improve my plant's pollution and the guy down the road also does it with his plant at the same time, how do we work out the respective environmental improvements as being down to me or to him? We can't do that easily. Kunda, being isolated, removes that problem. The analysis I'm going to present is set in the year 1995. We are considering a specific point in Kunda's history when some major environmental improvement investments were made. But before this, let's take a step back and give a bit of history. Kunda was set up in the 1860s by a wealthy local landowner, Jean Girard de Soucanton. He saw the possibility of producing cement using local raw materials. The first tons of cement were manufactured in 1870. By the 1890s, a railway line was built and a port was completed, as well as a hydroelectric power station. All of these were groundbreaking in Estonia at the time. By the end of the 19th century, the company had become a modern factory with state-of-the-art equipment. In 1940, the factory was nationalized. The factory's production was stopped in the Second World War and restarted after the war was over. During the 1960s, the cement factory was rebuilt in Soviet style and became one of the major polluters in the region. It actually became one of the greatest environmental problems of Soviet Estonia at that time. After privatization in 1992, Kunda Nordic Cement was formed as the successor of the state-operated cement company. In 1995, its manufacturing was thoroughly renovated, and this is the part of its history that we're going to examine in detail in our case. One of the interesting characteristics of Kunda is that its original 19th century plant, which is no longer functional and which was left abandoned, has since become a major tourist attraction thanks to its very characteristic brick buildings and the beautiful nature that has grown in amongst the buildings. Today, Kunda Cement is part of the Global Cement Heidelberg Group. So here we are in 1995, and I'm the new owner of Kunda out of the privatization, and we've drawn up an investment plan. Part of that investment plan, 22 million, is the investment to improve the factory and increase production efficiency, profitability, and so forth. But about 9 million is environmental investments to improve the general environment around the factory. We can see these are broken down into various technical categories, such as oil shale preparation improvements, kiln improvements, grinding improvements, and a variety of others. The question is, are these investments worthwhile investments to make, both from the point of view of the investor and the point of view of the wider stakeholder community? So what we need to figure out is how much of a return will we get on this 8.7 million of environmental investments. And this needs to be a serious exercise if we are able to make a strong case for environmental investments. To proceed, we have a 5-step process which we're going to follow in this case. The first step is we're going to identify the specific pollution impacts. The second step is we're going to choose which impacts can reasonably be quantified and which cannot. Third step, we're going to describe the non-quantifiable impacts so we are aware of them. Fourth step, we're going to value those selected impacts which we can quantify. And once we've done all of this, our fifth step is to evaluate our environmental investment using net present value and economic rate of return. Let's start with step number one, identifying pollution impacts. So what kind of pollution is Kunda responsible for? Well, basically we've got three types of pollution. We have firstly dust emissions, secondly sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions, and thirdly water supply contamination. The people and things impacted are a wide range, from workers and local residents, to the growth of trees and plants, to local livestock, to buildings and streets, to the general image of the town, to real estate values, to tourism levels, to people's health, and to the fish population as well. Now, we need to make a decision about what pollution impacts we can quantify and which we cannot. Because for the ones we choose to quantify, the quantification must be credible, based upon a sound methodology so that people will accept it. By looking at the details, we've decided that we're able to quantify health, forestry, agriculture, soiling, tourism and recreation, real estate values, and the direct impact of gas emissions. We're not going to try and quantify fish, the general town's image, milk and dairy production, other horticultural production, or the acid rain effects, because we simply do not have enough of a methodology to come up with reliable numbers, and that's perfectly acceptable. We know that non-quantifiable impacts are going to improve things, but we won't try to attach some dubious numbers to them. To help us get a little bit of more of a framework on the environmental impacts, it is a relatively easy exercise to estimate which is the relevant area affected by the different types of pollution. And as you might imagine, the majority of this is local. And the more local it is, the easier it is to quantify it. Whereas the more wide-ranging the effect is, the more difficult it will be to quantify. In this table, we can see that it ranges from very local phenomenon, like the health of the local population, all the way through to very wide-ranging phenomenon, such as salmon spawning or tree growth. Okay, now that we've set the stage in the general context, it's time to really get into the guts of the numbers. And this is where the science comes in. And this is also where we have to go through it line by line and really understand how we can get these numbers. If you can get this, you are going to really nail ESG in private equity. The first one is the effects of the environmental investments on the materials and operating costs. The plant's operating costs are going to be affected by the environmental investments in the production process in two ways. Firstly, 2/3 of the dust collected will be returned into the production process, and this will save limestone raw material costs. Secondly, the remaining dust will be disposed into a new industrial waste dump at an annual cost. The change in benefits and costs associated with this investment can be shown here. We're going to be saving $640,000 of raw material costs. It will cost $400,000 to make these investments, and the dust removal will cost $69,000. Adding these up, this represents a net saving of $173,000 a year in raw material costs. The second main item is soiling and material effects. The town of Kunda has been soiled from the thousands of tons of cement dust that have been falling on the town for all these years. So firstly, the effect of that is that surfaces become dirty more quickly than they would in the absence of dust, so that streets and sidewalks have to be swept or dusted more frequently, and clothing must also be washed more frequently. Secondly, the dust, which is alkaline, tends to damage painted surfaces such as walls, doors and automobiles. In interviews with the residents, it was established that the average period between house painting, which is normally 8 years, was shortened to 4 years because of the cement dust. Cars also needed to be washed and repainted more frequently. Some other detailed findings of the survey in Kunda were combined with some studies made in the US which estimated the cost of soiling based upon the level of concentration of dust material per cubic meter, and therefore applying this US parameter of $1.5 per 1 microgram per cubic meter, which we applied to the inhabitants of Kunda, this resulted in economic benefit of $287,000 per year. The third item is real estate. In order to estimate the effect on real estate, the study looked at several factors. In 1994, the Estonian government assigned some property values for tax purposes, but these prices were about 1/20th to 1/10th for that of comparable land in Finland, and so it was decided that these were not representative enough. Studies from the US and other countries show that property prices would decrease by between 5% and 14% depending on the level of soiling. Then the study looked at the town of Kunda and established that the total acreage was 1,000 hectares, of which 66% was buildings, and the remaining was vacant lots and fields. An average value of $19.2 per square meter of buildings in Finnish towns, similar to Kunda, was applied as a kind of border parity price. And based on this, we were able to calculate a total real estate benefit of $6.3 million. Let's now turn to the fourth item, which is that of health. In discussions with the Estonian government officials, it became clear that the health problems in Kunda were very significant and were related primarily to respiratory and dermatological illnesses. It became also evident that it would be overly complex to estimate the health impacts directly on the local population because of time and budget limitations and because of the movement of the population. Therefore, studies from Finland and Sweden were relied upon. These were applied to a cross-section of Kunda workers who were compared to a control group of workers in a meat packing plant in a location 30 kilometers from Kunda. Based upon these studies, it became possible to estimate the total number of morbidity effects based upon number of affected people according to the different types of issue that was relevant and based upon the number of incidents per year. Using some studies from the United States, it was possible to assign a dollar cost for each morbidity incident, and therefore we could get to a calculation. So, for example, it was estimated that hospital admittances affected 4,700 people, and that there would be 1.13 incidents on an annual basis, which resulted in a cost per incident of $6,306. This gave us a total annual volume of morbidity costs for this item of $7,126. Adding across the categories results in a total annual healthcare saving of about $372,000. Next, we turn to the fifth item, the costs of forestry, which luckily is a lot easier than the medical costs we just worked out. About 46% of the affected areas are covered by commercial forest, which gives a total volume of forest of about 700,000 cubic meters. This is divided into deciduous trees with 51%, pine 38%, and spruce 11%. Deciduous, by the way, means trees that shed their leaves at winter, so the opposite of evergreen. Scientifically, it was established that the cement dust from the plant retarded tree growth by obstructing photosynthesis and by negatively affecting soil composition. The findings showed that 70% was due to the former and 30% to the latter. The average growth deficit in the affected area, compared to some non-affected areas which were used as a control, was 12% for pine and 20% for spruce. This resulted in volumes of 1,000 cubic meters for pine and 420 cubic meters for spruce each year. The net price for both of them is $35 per cubic meter. So multiplying these figures in cubic meters by $35, we can estimate a total benefit of $34,790 per year. Let's now turn to agriculture, our sixth item. Cement dust fallout affected about 1,850 hectares of agricultural land. The crops locally consist of barley, wheat, oats, and potatoes. Early research found that depending on the species, the growth was 23% to 33% lower in the heavily polluted areas within 1 kilometer of the factory. As the dust fallout decreases over a wider radius, the yield reduction averages in the wider area about 10%, and this affects 1,850 hectares of farmland. The dust effects are the smallest in the cold and rainy season and the largest when the growing season has been warm and sunny. The average price of crops in the affected area was estimated to be $770 per hectare. If we include the handling and transport costs, this gets us up to $830 per hectare. So calculating an increase in yield by 10%, we are therefore able to calculate a total benefit of $101,000 per year. Tourism and recreation, our seventh item, is a bit more of a tricky one to calculate because of the economics and a lack of data in Estonia at that time. Recreational and tourism activities were definitely less around Kunda than anywhere else because of its reputation as a grey city and because of the dust dispersion. It is obvious that if air pollution is going to be substantially reduced, tourism will increase because of the proximity to the sea and other factors. Most of the tourists in the area are Estonian nationals. In neighbouring areas, an estimated 2,000 Estonians and 300 foreigners went on vacation. We assume, therefore, that with a reduction of pollution, the number of vacations in the area will increase by 1,000 Estonians and by 150 foreigners. The difference in tourism volume between the two scenarios after 15 years would be 2,000 domestic tourists and 3,000 foreign tourists. This is quite complicated, but bear with me. Then, based on some 1992 data, we were able to establish that a domestic tourist spent about 14 days per stay and foreign tourists spent about 2.5 days per stay. We also have estimates for their total expenditure on a daily basis, which is higher for foreign tourists than for locals. If we multiply this into 2,000 domestic tourists and 300 foreign tourists, we reach the result of $196,000 spent per year. We then need to make some adjustments to this number because of the difficulty in calculating the border prices for goods and services consumed by tourists, and therefore we went and checked the tourist expenditures in Finland as a proxy. These were $96 a day for foreigners and $46 a day for local tourists. And then we assumed that 50% of tourist expenditure was related to tradables and 50% to non-tradables such as labour and utilities. Using this Finnish data, we're able to make appropriate adjustments to our estimates for the total spend of tourists to reflect a more contemporary purchasing power. And this resulted in a final spend of $43,000 in year 1 and $633,000 per year in year 15, with a kind of linear progression from year 1 to year 15. I hope you're not too exhausted. We're almost there. Now we can turn to our eighth item, gas emissions, which is sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. The new investments will result in lowering sulfur dioxide emissions by over 1,200 tonnes a year and nitrous oxide emissions by 200 tonnes per year. Because these gases are transported over long distances, those originating in Kunda will affect areas far beyond Estonia's boundaries. To estimate the benefits of the cost of reduction, a study made by a Finnish institute was used as one of the reference points. Some of the most significant impact of gas emissions were the following. Firstly, morbidity. It was established that there was a link between sulfur dioxide air concentration and the cough days for children and the chest discomfort for adults. Secondly, it was established that there was a link between sulfur dioxide concentration in the air and the deterioration of structural materials like zinc-plated steel, painted steel, aluminium, concrete and wood. Thirdly, forest growth. Forest damages due to acidification have been estimated in several studies made in Finland and other countries. Sulfur dioxide was found responsible for 60% of acidification, nitrogen oxides for 30% and ammonia for the rest. Fourthly, crop production. The combination of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic substances produces ozone, part of which is from pollution imported from other countries. The results from several relevant studies were applied to estimate relevant damage to crops. Fifth, water pollution. Water pollution damage is estimated from the acidification of groundwater, which causes corrosion in water pipes and a reduction in fish populations. Based upon these studies, we were able to estimate a dollar cost of pollution per kilogram of sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides. And then, calculating these numbers into a 1,200 tonne reduction and a 200 tonne reduction gave us a total benefit of $810,000. This has all been very technical and complicated, but the good news is that the complication is over. We're finished doing our calculations, and so now all that is left for us to do is to plug in these numbers into a simple Excel sheet and add them up. And if we look at this table, it's not particularly difficult now that we have a dollar value per different category of pollution, either as an absolute amount, like in the case of real estate, or an annual amount in the case of others. We can therefore now discount these back over a relevant timescale. We use a 10% discount rate and get a net present value of all the various items. So let's look at this table. We see the total costs of implementing the environmental investments is about $11.5 million, which includes the operating costs. And we see that the benefits are now categorized in the various items that we just discussed in a lot of detail now. We have raw material savings of 4.86 million. We have a reduction in soiling of 2.4 million. We have health improvements of 3 million. The benefits of a reduction in gases is almost 7 million. And so we have net benefits, total benefits, which have calculated to the wider society. We have a massive 26 million for an investment of just 8 million. Expressing it as an economic rate of return, which is a kind of IRR for the wider environment, we've got an economic rate of return of just under 25%. So looking at the numbers, these environmental investments have certainly proven themselves to have a huge benefit to society. An 8 million investment generating 26 million. I mean, how good is that? One thing we should not forget to do maybe is to look at who actually benefits, namely which different stakeholders are going to benefit from these different environmental investments and benefits that we just did. So let's go through that. We can see that as far as forestry and agriculture are concerned, this will benefit forest owners and farmers within a 5-kilometre radius of the plants. The reduction in raw material costs and the reduction in employee turnover will benefit the project sponsor. So it's good business for him as well. The increased tourism will benefit enterprises and employees in the region. The reduced soiling and material damages will be good for residents. The reduced healthcare costs will be good for workers and residents. The real estate values will be good for owners of real estate in the area, and the reduced emissions from sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide will be good for Estonia in general and the European countries nearest Estonia. So this is a win-win for a very wide range of stakeholders. What have we achieved with this exercise? Well, what we've done is by calculating the impacts of environmental investments in specific areas, we have a more credible case to advocate ESG. But what we can see is that it was complicated, multidisciplinary as an exercise. We've got forestry experts, agronomists, medical experts, gas and emissions experts, engineers, and various other experts who had to come in. This means that you should be wary if an ESG study containing technical elements like the one I described is only done by a financial analyst with some improvised knowledge. There is too much of that going on right now in 2020, with ESG being so trendy and everyone trying to be an expert. Another complication that we had to overcome are things like attribution, which I mentioned earlier. We also have had to make some very strong assumptions and transpose studies from other countries. We have had to make sure our sources are strong. We have some impacts that we could identify, but not measure or quantify. This is all very, very complicated. But if you can see that if it's done in a rigorous way, it's a powerful way to justify environmental investments. And secondly, it's something credible because if you calculate numbers which are solid, you do have a credible case, and quantification helps you to identify the main priorities of where the environmental investments can have the most impact. The skill you'll need as a private equity investment officer is experience of working with other disciplines on a project and putting it all together. In the case of Kunda, you would need to work and coordinate agronomists, economists, biologists, medical experts, engineers, and others. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this case. It is demanding, but if you have understood this case and its methodology, you've got one of the most strong building blocks towards really nailing ESG, and that is very topical today.